Royal routines don't often leave room for surprise, especially when every move shadows over the palace. The clock of Buckingham Palace chimed the late hour with a resonance that rolled across the ancient stone walls like a solemn hymn. Its 12 deep tolls echoed into the vast ceremonial corridors where generations of monarchs had once walked in triumph and disgrace. Tonight the palace breathed a quiet unease, a hush broken only by the distant rustle of silk drapery and the muted footfall of royal attendants moving with deliberate caution. It was here, beneath gilded ceilings and chandeliers fashioned of crystal and silver, that a private communique had been drafted, reviewed, sealed, and finally released to the world just minutes ago. For centuries, these halls had carried declarations of coronations, wars, negotiations, births, and abdications. Yet, the message tonight bore a more intimate human weight. It concerned Prince Louis, once merely the joyful youngest child of the royal lineage, now standing on the threshold of adolescence, facing challenges hidden from public view until now. The official statement from the palace press office was crafted with both poetic restraint and legal precision. It confirmed that the prince had been privately evaluated for a medical concern, observed discreetly for several years, and that his condition had reached a stage where future expectations and ceremonial obligations must be altered. The exact wording avoided alarm, yet beneath its elegant phrasing lay a seismic shift. Those who read carefully understood that the young prince's role in the monarchy would no longer follow the traditional arc once anticipated. Within the private royal apartments, heavy velvet curtains had been drawn against the night. The queen consort stood at the balcony door, watching silhouettes gather beyond the palace gates, their faces illuminated by candles and handheld lanterns. The crowd was modest for now, composed of loyal admirers, curious onlookers, and quiet citizens seeking clarity. Many held placards painted in soft watercolor shades, bearing messages of prayer, hope, and unity. The queen consort placed a hand to her chest, not as a gesture of performance, but a sincere response to collective compassion. She did not speak. Her silence held both gratitude and sorrow. In the press wing on the lower floors, staff reviewed the global ripple of the announcement. News outlets across continents prepared early editions. Editors conferred in hushed tones, aware that the story required reverence rather than sensationalism. Headlines chosen were dignified, focusing on familial resolve, not speculation. Journalists refrained from conjecture, knowing that the monarchy, despite its grandeur, remained bound by the vulnerability of human life. Meanwhile, within the prince's private study, tutors and advisors sat in a semicircle around the hearth. The prince remained seated in a high-backed chair upholstered in sapphire velvet, staring into the fire. The flames danced like molten amber, casting long shadows that flickered across his face. There was no fear in his gaze, only a heavy contemplation beyond his years. Though protected from the frenzy outside, he sensed a profound shift had occurred. His life would no longer be guided solely by childhood joy, but by the delicate balance between privacy and duty. Advisors spoke gently, explaining what the announcement meant. Certain public expectations would be reduced. Some ceremonial roles would be postponed, perhaps indefinitely. The prince listened carefully, grasping both the burden and freedom such news carried. One counselor placed a hand on his shoulder, telling him that the value of a royal life was not measured by the number of appearances, but by the honor of purposeful existence. He nodded, absorbing the words like ancient prophecy. Elsewhere in the palace, senior members of the royal household met in the council chamber, its polished mahogany table reflecting lamplight like a mirror to history itself. Pages from archival records lay open, revealing past instances where tradition bent to circumstance. This was not the first time destiny rewrote the script of monarchy. Advisors whispered about public expectations, constitutional symbolism, and the future of royal continuity. They did not speak of disgrace, but adaptation. The voice moves through like a steady current, reminding that history often turns not through declarations shouted from balconies, but through conversations spoken in locked rooms behind velvet curtains. Centuries of royal lineage have endured crusades, political unrest, romantic scandals, tragic losses, and global upheaval. Now the trials of a single young heir joined that lineage, not as spectacle, but as quiet evolution. Outside the palace gates, more people gathered as night deepened. A choir of school children sang softly, their voices drifting above the stone courtyard. Police remained present not as guards against disorder, but as protectors of peaceful vigil. Streetlights reflected across polished cobblestones, transforming the scene into a tableau of reverence rather than chaos. The palace flag hung heavy at half-mast. It signaled not death, but solemn recognition that a chapter in royal expectation had closed. The symbolism was deliberate and ancient. The monarchy had always communicated through subtle gestures rather than proclamations. High above, portraits of sovereigns looked down from gilded frames along the grand gallery. Kings crowned through conquest. Queens strengthened through diplomacy. Monarchs who ruled while carrying private suffering invisible to the public. Their painted eyes watched as history once again reshaped the destiny of a future heir. The final images of this linger on moonlight gleaming across palace stone. The prince gazing silently into the fireplace and a nation holding its breath in collective anticipation. Tonight did not end an era. It began a reckoning. Whispers behind closed doors. Dawn broke over London with a pale, silvery glow that washed across the palace lawns like frost-kissed silk. The first rays of sunlight touched the towers of Buckingham Palace, illuminating the ornate crest above the central balcony. By sunrise, the city already buzzed with a restrained melancholy. Crowds gathered again, not in disorder, but in devoted silence. Newspapers were sold out at kiosks before breakfast, their headlines printed in measured fonts that reflected dignity rather than gossip. Citizens read in hushed cafes, sharing glances rather than words, knowing something delicate had shifted within the monarchy. Inside the palace, a more urgent day began. The Privy Council chamber, a room where crowned heads had signed treaties and sworn oaths for centuries, was arranged for a confidential assembly. Heavy drapes filtered the morning sun into thin ribbons of gold across the polished mahogany table. Senior advisors, royal legal counsel, senior courtiers, and representatives of the crown estate filed in with the solemnity of cathedral worshippers. They spoke in quiet tones, aware that every conversation here might ripple across generations. At precisely 9 o'clock, the king entered. His presence did not command the room loudly, but with the quiet authority of lineage and burden. He took his seat, folded his hands, and allowed the prime secretary to begin the briefing. A stack of documents lay before them, each marked with a crest and sealed with crimson wax. The previous night, physicians from private royal clinics had submitted their assessments. Specialists from esteemed medical institutions had contributed second opinions delivered discreetly to avoid public suspicion. Their findings confirmed what had been monitored privately for years. The prince would lead a life of capability and intellect, but one that required ongoing medical supervision, strain, prolonged engagements, and extended ceremonial duties could jeopardize long-term well-being. The council had not gathered to debate science. They convened to discuss monarchy itself. Tradition assumed that all royal children destined for seniority would undergo public training. They would attend diplomatic tours, military ceremonies, charity visits, and state functions beginning in later adolescence. That expectation no longer aligned with the prince's future. The discussion was not framed as removal from destiny, but tailoring destiny to humanity. One advisor proposed a strategy where his public duties would be minimized while emphasizing private service. Another suggested a redirection toward archival stewardship, a role steeped in heritage and history rather than spectacle. A cultural minister argued passionately that the monarchy must evolve, not diminish. She insisted that a modern crown should accommodate the needs of its heirs, not mold them into rigid archetypes. The king listened, occasionally nodding. Inside, he balanced two identities, sovereign and father. The weight of those dual roles settled over him like an invisible mantle. He did not speak for many minutes, allowing others to shape the early framework of resolution. Yet when he finally addressed the room, His words were measured and profound. He declared that service should be a calling, not a confinement. The monarchy must not demand from family what it would never demand from citizens. As long as the prince lived with honor and contribution, the form of that contribution need not mirror tradition. Outside the council walls, life went on with uneasy normalcy. By midday, the palace kitchen staff delivered meals to flower layers gathered beyond the gates. Church bells chimed across Westminster, not in mourning, but in solidarity. Public messages filled social channels with reflections about vulnerability, compassion, and modern leadership. Commentators praised the monarchy's restraint while urging further clarity. A small minority questioned whether privacy outweighed constitutional transparency. These dissenting voices, though respectful, sparked necessary dialogue. In the afternoon, diplomatic offices across the Commonwealth received encrypted briefings. They assured allied nations that the line of succession remained clear and that the prince's altered role would not destabilize representation abroad. Some leaders responded with personal letters expressing empathy for the young royal and respect for the family's quiet fortitude. Meanwhile, in the royal nursery wing, the prince spent the day shielded from the storm of reaction outside. Tutors focused on literature, geography, and historical ethics. Yet his attention drifted. He asked his instructors simple questions that adults struggled to answer. Would duties he once imagined slip away entirely? Would his siblings have to shoulder more responsibility because of him? Was he failing before he had even begun? The queen consort joined him for supper in a private salon overlooking the spring garden. The meal was quiet, composed of his favorite dishes, chosen to restore comfort rather than ceremony. Their conversation unfolded with soft pauses. He confessed he did not wish to disappoint anyone. She replied that disappointment arises only when one abandons purpose, and his purpose had not changed, only its shape. He looked up with cautious hope, his lips forming a faint smile. As twilight deepened, a final meeting concluded the day's internal discourse. The king signed a resolution authorizing the communications office to prepare a second statement. This next release would clarify the prince's continuing education, health support, and evolving future within the monarchy. It would not be dramatic or revealing, but it would provide stability in narrative and calm the storm of public conjecture. Outside, the palace lights ignited one by one, dotting the facade in warm shades of ivory and gold. Torches and candles held by citizens glittered like stars reflected upon water. Voices sang hymns not of grief but of unity. The gates remained closed, yet the invisible bridge between monarchy and people felt newly reinforced. History, it reminds, is not shaped by events alone, but by how institutions choose to respond when confronted by vulnerability. The palace had chosen transparency over silence, compassion over rigidity, evolution over tradition. This decision would echo through future crowns and chronicles. The kingdom did not merely observe change tonight. It became part of it. The public reckoning. The announcement had been public for only a few days. Yet the ripple of reaction had already swept across every tier of society. London awoke to overcast skies, the type that cast the city in a muted palette of gray stone and subdued reflection. Citizens walked with newspapers folded beneath their arms, sipping tea in silence rather than conversation. Familiar chatter about daily politics and sport had been replaced with thoughtful concern. The realm was not merely reacting to news about a young prince's health, but to an evolving interpretation of what it meant to serve a monarchy in the modern age. By mid-morning, public institutions across the country organized forums, lectures, and discussions. Universities hosted panels where historians sat beside sociologists to debate whether hereditary tradition should bend to personal well-being. Advocates argued that true leadership required space for individual growth rather than rigid expectation. Critics countered that the monarchy owed its relevance to continuity, not flexibility. Though passionate, the discourse remained respectful, as if the nation understood that its words would echo across palace corridors, shaping decisions not yet finalized. In homes and classrooms, the matter took on a more intimate tone. Teachers guided students through conversations about empathy for public figures, reminding them that royal heirs were still children who did not choose their birthright. At one rural school, children created cards painted in watercolor hues of gold and sapphire. Their handwritten messages spoke not of titles, but of strength, courage, and peace. Palace staff later received these cards in canvas mailbags, sorting them with meticulous care in a hall temporarily converted into an archive of affection. By the third day, letters numbered in the thousands, each one bearing witness to a nation's collective heart. Across the media landscape, a shift unfolded. Commentators on public broadcasts abandoned their usual adversarial tone in favor of measured reflection. Radio hosts encouraged listeners to phone in, not with opinions, but with personal stories about navigating expectations and limitations. Some callers spoke of children facing invisible struggles. Others spoke of lives reshaped by illness, injury, or emotional burdens. These voices, though not royal, resonated powerfully. They reminded the nation that vulnerability was universal. Meanwhile, the palace communications team prepared a follow-up statement. Drafts were reviewed by physicians, heritage advisors, constitutional scholars, and senior royals. The final wording acknowledged the prince's need for long-term medical support, while affirming his continued education and readiness to serve in meaningful roles behind the scenes. It did not offer diagnosis or prognosis. Instead, it emphasized humanity and dignity. The release sparked a mixture of relief and contemplation. Citizens appreciated transparency, yet many remained uncertain about what the future held. Diplomatic circles responded with thoughtful consistency. Embassies across Europe and the Commonwealth conveyed messages of solidarity. Some leaders suggested collaborative cultural projects that the prince might eventually support. Others proposed expanding philanthropic networks to accommodate his shifting role. The common theme across every response was respect. No nation sought to exploit the moment for political leverage. Instead, they recognized that monarchy, though symbolic, required compassion when fate intervened. As official channels addressed institutional concerns, the palace resumed daily operations. State visitors arrived and were greeted by senior royals serving on behalf of the family. Princess Charlotte began attending select engagements once reserved for her younger brother. Her poise impressed commentators, though she carried her duties with quiet humility, never overshadowing his journey. Prince George, preparing for early diplomatic education, studied international law and constitutional governance. The siblings' increased visibility was not presented as a burden, but as familial solidarity. Public perception evolved as well. Early whispers of speculation faded. Conspiracy theories weakened under the weight of clarity. Citizens recognized that the announcement was not a brushstroke of scandal, but an act of honesty from a family long entwined with public scrutiny. Newspapers shifted from anxious headlines to portraits of resilience. Columnists praised the monarchy for preserving dignity in the face of personal challenge. One widely circulated editorial declared that history would remember this moment not because of illness, but because of compassion. Inside the palace, the prince continued his studies. Though his curriculum adapted subtly, tutors introduced him to conservation science, literature analysis, archival artistry, and the preservation of cultural heritage. Curators from royal estates visited to discuss ancient manuscripts, lost artworks, and the role of historical guardianship. The prince showed particular interest in restoration techniques, asking whether damaged artifacts could be revived without erasing their scars. His instructors exchanged quiet looks, sensing metaphor beneath his curiosity. In the evenings, he walked the private gardens accompanied by guardians and advisors. Their conversations drifted between ordinary childhood musings and profound questions about purpose. He wondered whether history valued heirs who lived outside the public spotlight. One advisor told him that legacy was not measured by crowds but by what one gives to others, especially when no one is watching. The prince took those words to heart. Meanwhile, his family shielded him from pressure. They shared private meals, played board games, and encouraged laughter. They reminded him that lineage did not erase humanity. Each moment of ordinary closeness offered healing beyond medicine. As dusk descended on the capital, Citizens lit candles along riverbanks and cathedral steps, not in sorrow, but in tribute. Musicians performed soft orchestral pieces, their notes echoing through public squares. It was as though the entire nation exhaled as one, embracing uncertainty without fear. Some arrived through politics, others through war, and others through personal trial. The present moment belonged to the latter. Yet the kingdom, rather than fracturing, chose empathy. It recognized that the crown was not solely forged in tradition, but sustained by the grace of its people. This was not a crisis of identity. It was the beginning of transformation. A kingdom reflects. Winter descended upon London with a quiet severity that transformed the city into a landscape of dim lantern glow and distant cathedral bells. Snowfall arrived not in heavy drifts, but in delicate flurries that dusted palace railings and settled upon the bronze statues that ring the Victoria Memorial. The atmosphere was contemplative rather than bleak, a season of reflection rather than despair. Citizens moved through the capital wrapped in woolen coats and thoughtful silence, their conversations gentle, their sentiments softened by time. The initial shock of the palace announcement had faded, replaced by a maturing understanding of how vulnerability reshapes legacy. With the passing of weeks, candlelight vigils grew across the realm. They appeared in small clusters outside village churches, beneath archways of historic universities, along coastlines where waves crashed into frozen stone. These gatherings were not coordinated by government leaders nor royal officials. They arose organically from communities moved by shared empathy. At each vigil, someone read poetry, another played violin, and children held lanterns decorated with painted crowns. The tone was reverent, as though the nation recognized that compassion itself had become a form of allegiance. Broadcasting networks aired special programs exploring the history of monarchy under strain. Historians recounted stories of kings and queens who had grappled with personal hardship behind closed curtains. Some suffered illness in silence. Others relinquished public life to seek spiritual solace or scholarly pursuits. The contrast between those hidden histories and the present moment was striking. Modern society no longer accepts secrecy as strength. The royal family's decision to speak openly allowed past and present to converge, forging a more humane narrative. Within palace walls, winter brought both stillness and purpose. Plans were quietly drafted to reorganize the distribution of royal duties. Princess Charlotte, with her poise and natural ease in public settings, began assuming additional engagements on behalf of the crown. Her itinerary included school visits, cultural gatherings, and charitable receptions. Observers noted that she carried not the weight of burden, but the dignity of shared responsibility. She did not step into the spotlight to replace her brother, but to walk beside him, honoring the family bond that transcended ceremonial expectation. Prince George, meanwhile, entered a new stage of preparation. His studies expanded to include constitutional theory, cultural diplomacy, and the complexities of Commonwealth relations. Though still young, he approached his role with a quiet seriousness inherited from his forebears. Mentors reminded him that authority is not defined by volume but by restraint and wisdom. He understood that the shifting role of his younger brother did not elevate his own importance, but deepened his duty. On a night when snowfall settled softly across the palace gardens, he ventured outside accompanied by a longtime advisor. Lanterns hanging from wrought iron hooks illuminated narrow pathways lined with ancient oaks. The branches bowed gently beneath the weight of snow, forming arches like cathedral aisles. Their footsteps were the only sound, muffled by frost. The scene felt far removed from the gilded halls and ceremonial expectations that had defined his upbringing. As they walked, the advisor spoke of monarchs throughout history who had served from the periphery rather than the throne. Some devoted themselves to scholarship and preservation. Others championed its spiritual leadership or quiet philanthropy. Power, he said, was not always loud or visible. It could be enduring even in the shadows. The prince listened, absorbing each word with the solemn curiosity of someone forging identity rather than inheriting it. They paused beside a marble fountain at the heart of the garden. The water had frozen into crystalline stillness. capturing the reflection of lantern light like trapped stars. The prince confessed that he feared being forgotten by history, that stepping away from public ceremony might erase his name from future generations. The advisor responded softly that history does not remember those who shine the brightest, but those who illuminate others. Legacy, he said, is a tapestry woven from countless threads, not a single strand. The prince lowered his gaze, contemplating the frozen water as though glimpsing centuries beyond the present. Inside the palace, other quiet shifts unfolded. Courtiers began reorganizing calendars to reflect new structures of representation. Historians curated archives to prepare future exhibits celebrating diverse forms of royal service. Charitable organizations drafted proposals that aligned with the prince's growing interests in cultural preservation and education advocacy. Each action demonstrated that adaptation did not weaken tradition. It refined it. Across the realm, public sentiment continued to soften. Newspaper editorials praised the royal family's humility in acknowledging limitations. Writers argued that the monarchy had gained credibility, not lost authority. Compassion has become a cornerstone of modern sovereignty. The story was no longer framed as a retreat from duty, but as a reimagining of duty itself. Meanwhile, international observers watched with measured admiration. In distant capitals, political analysts expressed surprise that transparency from a monarchy could strengthen national unity. Cultural essays emerged comparing historical eras of royal secrecy with the present chapter of openness. Some predicted that future generations would cite this moment as a turning point in the evolution of constitutional monarchy. In the final weeks of winter, the palace hosted a small private gathering in the grand ballroom. Only family and close advisors attended. No cameras recorded the event. No journalists waited outside. The gathering was not a ceremony, but a reaffirmation of familial solidarity. Music played softly from a string quartet. The prince's siblings stood beside him as the king addressed them privately, acknowledging their shared responsibility and shared love. As the evening drew to a close, the prince looked across the ballroom toward towering portraits of past sovereigns. Their expressions carved in oil seemed to watch him with silent understanding. He did not feel diminished. He felt seen. A kingdom had confronted change not with uproar, but with wisdom. The royal family, long seen as a symbol of unchanging tradition, embraced a more human truth. In doing so, they aligned themselves not only with history, but with the future. Winter had not brought mourning. It brought clarity. The new path. Spring arrived not with fanfare, but with gentle persistence. Buds unfurled along the palace garden hedges, and blossoms appeared in soft pastels of rose, ivory, and violet. The air carried warmth that loosened winter's hold, offering a season of renewal both for the land and for the monarchy itself. For the first time in many months, the nation felt less like it was holding its breath and more like it was learning to breathe again. Change had settled into acceptance, and acceptance began to blossom into purpose. On a quiet morning near the end of April, the palace released what would be the final official statement regarding the prince's public role. The notice arrived not through elaborate ceremony, but through elegant parchment embossed with the royal crest. It confirmed the decisions reached across months of careful reflection. Prince Louis would no longer follow a path toward full ceremonial succession. Instead, he would pursue a curated life of cultural stewardship, preservation, and private service. His role would be quieter, yet no less meaningful. The statement spoke not of reduction, but redirection. It emphasized that nobility was not bound to throne rooms, but could thrive in archives, libraries, and quiet acts of guardianship. The public received the news with solemn grace. Crowds no longer gathered with anxious anticipation, but with calm reverence. Rather than mourn what might have been, citizens celebrated what could be. Letters continued to arrive at the palace gates. Though their tone had shifted, they no longer expressed fear or sympathy, but encouragement. Children sent sketches of ancient buildings, tapestries, and manuscripts as if offering inspirations for the prince's future work. Adults wrote messages about resilience, art, in the beauty of purpose that unfolds away from spectacle. The palace grounds reflected this shift in mood. Flowers once left in sorrow now arrived tied with ribbons, in hopeful shades of lavender and emerald. Volunteers assisted attendants in collecting tributes to incorporate into future charity exhibits. The nation no longer saw the prince as a figure stepping away from destiny, but as someone stepping toward another form of destiny entirely. The most symbolic moment, however, did not unfold before crowds or cameras within the palace's archival wing. A ceremony took place attended only by immediate family and a select group of historians and curators. The wing itself was a cathedral of knowledge, lined with towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, gilded records, and ancient documents preserved behind glass. Candlelight flickered across marble floors, echoing softly beneath vaulted ceilings. Court musicians played a quiet quartet, their notes reverent and sincere. At the center of the room stood the king, flanked by the queen consort. The prince stood before them, not dressed in military regalia, nor formal ceremony attire, but in simple tailored garments reflecting humility and purpose. The king spoke softly, praising his son, not for what he might one day do in public view, but for the integrity he had shown throughout this transition. He acknowledged the courage required to accept a future shaped not by expectation, but by personal truth. He placed a hand upon his son's shoulder, offering words meant for no other ears. Princess Charlotte and Prince George stood nearby, their presence not symbolic but deeply familial. They did not assume roles above him. They stood with him. The siblings exchanged brief smiles, the type only shared by those walking different paths within the same legacy. The moment was not a farewell to tradition, but a reconsecration of identity. Later that evening, as the family dined privately, the prince asked whether he would still accompany them on future engagements. The king responded that he would when he wished, but only when those engagements aligned with his well-being and chosen purpose. The queen consort added that his journey would be shaped not by public need, but by personal calling. Their words settled upon him like a blessing. In the following weeks, plans unfolded to integrate the prince into new areas of influence. He began apprenticing under archivists and conservators tasked with preserving centuries of royal history. He studied ancient textile restoration, manuscript preservation, and heritage ethics. Curators remarked on his meticulous attention to detail and his fascination with connecting forgotten artifacts to their cultural origins. He did not seek recognition. He sought meaning. Orders were drafted for future exhibitions, highlighting the history of royal service beyond the throne. These exhibits would feature contributions from princes, princesses, scholars, and figures whose impact was profound yet quiet. The prince's involvement in these projects remained discreet, though those who worked beside him understood that he was becoming a steward of legacy rather than a symbol of lineage. Beyond palace walls, life continued its seasonal rhythm. Citizens returned to everyday routines, comforted by stability. Public ceremonies remained well attended, though no longer fueled by curiosity or anxiety. Instead, they reflected unity. The monarchy had not collapsed beneath vulnerability. It had matured through it. International observers continued their commentary, noting that the crown had redefined leadership by acknowledging limits. Analysts predicted that future monarchies might adopt similar structures, prioritizing personal agency without dismantling tradition. Some called the moment revolutionary. Others called it overdue. The prince's life had not narrowed. It had expanded inward. He had traded the spotlight of balcony appearances for the enduring legacy of preservation. His story was not one of abdication, but transformation. In an age of spectacle, he chose substance. In a lineage shaped by public gaze, he honored heritage through quiet stewardship. As spring sunlight filtered through the palace windows, dust motes floated like miniature constellations. The prince stood in the archive hall, turning the pages of a centuries-old manuscript with white-gloved hands. The ink, though faded, remained legible. History whispered through each delicate page. He understood then that his place in the royal chronicle was secure, not because he stood at its forefront, but because he safeguarded the story itself. Some destinies are written in gold upon banners, Others are written between lines preserved across centuries. The monarchy would remember both. Though this chronicle is a work of fiction, its themes of legacy, resiliency, and quiet transformation echo truths found across history. If you wish to explore more cinematic royal narratives and unfolding tales from across the world's crowned past, subscribe, share your thoughts below, and join our next journey.